Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this panel discussion that's being held on the topic of risk management and accountability in complex construction projects. This session is being held as part of the RAKEZ's World Built Environment Forum. My name is Cheryl Cairns, and I'm a partner and head of international construction at the law firm of Trowers Hamlins. I'm based in the firm's Dubai office, where I have been since 2007, working on large, complex construction infrastructure disputes, with a particular focus in arbitration. I'm very fortunate to be joined by today's discussion by my two co-panelists, who I will give an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves. We have Akash Paunikar, who's a contracts manager with Khaimah Economic Zone, together with Dafydd Owen, who is a partner with HKA. Akash, if you'd like to briefly introduce yourself, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Shay. Myself, Akash Paunikar. I'm basically a civil engineer, and I'm working in the construction industry from last 22 years. I'm fortunate that I got an opportunity to work with all the parties who are involved in the projects, like subcontractors, consultant, contractor, and right now working with the employer, who is the Khaimah Economic Zone. And that's all about me.
That's lovely, thank you. And Dafydd?
Yeah, morning Cheryl, morning everyone. Thanks for having me here today. My name's Dafydd Owen. It's a crazy Welsh name, so everyone calls me Daff. I head HK's advisory business globally. Until fairly recently, I was running our advisory business in the Asia-Pac region, and now have the dubious honour of growing that around the world. HKA, for those of you who don't know, is the world's leading construction claims and disputes business, which is somewhat depressing claim to fame that we've seen more projects go wrong than anyone. But I come from the kind of hope side of the equation from advisory, which is around setting up projects for success. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the next few minutes. Thanks, Cheryl.
Great, thank you. Well, as we said, the session is on construction risks. So to place things into context, it's probably helpful to start with asking what are the kind of major risks that can potentially befall very large construction projects. And certainly in my experience, risk tends to emanate probably from time, cost, and quality. So those risks then, in my experience, tend to lead to disputes between the parties. And certainly the time would seem to me to be one of the most important factors, particularly as margins continue to be very tight for contractors, programs very ambitious, and obviously we're still coming out of COVID-19, so issues around supply chains, availability of materials, and labour. So I wondered, obviously, very experienced panel, what your experience has been, Dafydd?
Yeah, all the ones you speak to are probably, the well documented, I guess, the time, cost, quality are the kind of major risks that tend to bite sort of late on, but most of them are caused early on. And I think this is has always been my contention. And when I speak to my claims colleagues, everyone's say, why do projects go wrong? Why do we end up with these risks really sort of manifesting? And often it's a result of contractors pricing a job too cheaply or not correctly. But actually, my contention has always been that actually there's a degree of unhelpful optimism at the front end of projects where people are convinced that we'll be different to every other project that goes wrong, and they tend to forego the really important stuff, which is by and large good planning. So I think optimism is kind of a major risk which never really appears on anyone's risk register. And I think that what we've seen is the obvious things that you've talked about, but I think the kind of the factors now are capacity, capability, and culture. And I think those are three things which, if you start to get right at the front of the life of the project, then it tends to be that the projects are more successful. And I think there's good case history around the world about the most successful projects have a really capable organization. They have enough capacity, they're not scrimping in those right places. And actually culturally, they're sort of wedded to try and find the right solution. And I think that what I've seen is a sort of negative trend, which again is the risk that manifests, is kind of this rushing to fail type of approach. And I think if you get this, there's a Bent Fluberg quote, which is planning is cheap, fixing problems is expensive, which I think is pretty right. So actually, if you get the project set up for success by taking enough time in the planning phase, then you can actually sort of mitigate a lot of the risks that bite at the back end. And I think that what we've seen a lot of government projects that we've worked on is that the minister or the premier, whoever it may be, is really keen to announce the project, and they'll announce the project and they'll maybe even award the project before it's ready. So slowing down, so go slow to go fast is probably the cliche I'd point to, which is to say, how do we make sure we've actually got this project set up for success?
Yeah, that's great, Dafydd. And Akash, anything from, obviously you're based in Khaimah in the Middle East. Is there anything in your experience to add?
So for me specifically, when it's completely depend on how well the contracts and the documents are in place, how well it is drafted. That is where the key is, and from where the dispute started. So specifically, if the intention of the parties are well enough, for example, if the most of the documents are drafted by the contractor, the employer. So what is the intention of the employer? How fairly he want to communicate everything to the contractor. And in addition to that, I have seen that many contracts are not based on the standard form of contracts. And contractors, for example, the contracts manager, if they do not able to identify the risks which are there in the contracts, and in the execution stage, yes, based on that the dispute started, and those becomes a risk. Yeah.
So I think it's thanks, Akash. I think it's fairly clear that all construction projects have an element of risk associated with them, and we've just talked about some of those risks. If the parties do rush to fail and don't identify those risks that we've talked about, what are some of the impacts that can affect the project? I'll go to Dafydd.
Sure, yeah, not backward and coming forward. So we've kind of talked about some of them. It's time and cost are the major factors, and those are the ones that everyone, I guess, is aware of, and probably are most prevalent when you see these things biting. And I would say that that's by and large true. The other thing is probably this change in output is that the project you get is not necessarily the project you want. And I think that what we've seen time and again is that people they work quite hard on the planning, and then when they deliver the project, they don't necessarily go back to check whether the business case has been realised, because there's been so many changes along the way because of risk that actually sometimes the output isn't as planned. So change in output, which is actually quite a serious consequence when you think about it. So I mentioned in the intro that HKA is the world's largest claims business. Now we've got data from something like $2 trillion worth of claims, and we've got this report called Crux that we produce each year. It's a really useful tool to find on the website. And when you actually start to look at what are the risks that contribute to these kind of time and cost and quality delays, they're the same the world over. So whether we're having this conversation in APAC or the Middle East, the UK, there's a really clear top 10. And they sort of point to that point I was making, which is this don't rush to fail. And actually, you look at number one risk, the number one kind of causation is change in scope. And that's a direct result of kind of poor planning, or let's just say, let's call it poor planning. And then there's other factors like design delays or the wrong design information. And all of these are kind of causations, but all of them have the same result, which is it's either going to take you longer to deliver the project, or it's going to cost you more, or ultimately the scope you get isn't what you've designed. And if we look at sort of the regional data, there's some good regions and there's some less good regions. And there's one I probably won't name, where the default setting is for projects to be late. And they're late to the tune of 85%. And that's an average for that region, which is staggering. And they're on average 35% over budget. So you start to think about, the scale of projects we're working on, they're all north of $1 billion. So 85%, 35% add up to some, new hospital wings or some new schools if you spend the money correctly. And so, I'll probably make this point, but if you get the planning right, then the project starts to look after itself.
No, that's great. And Akash, have you seen any potential impacts of risk on the projects that you've been responsible for managing? Oh, I think you're on mute, Akash. Sorry.
Sorry, yes. For me, all the risks are going to have ultimately impact on the cost. Either it's a time, false quality, safety, everything. So definitely, yeah, when the cost hits, the disputes started between the parties. You take any risk, for example, the safety risk. Now the contract is well drafted, saying that the contractor has to follow all the safety standards. So, however, if there is a risk occurs because of the safety, it will have an impact on the either on the contractor or the employer, and it comes on the cost. You take the design changes the scope of work, the type of procurement route specifically, for example, the design and build, where the employer is changing the design. Specifically, the contractor is coming with a huge variations. Yeah, so this kind of risk, which just now when talked about, so basically, if in the traditional procurement route, where again there is a change of scope, but little bit less risk compared to the design and build route. Yeah. So yeah, for me, ultimately, it will have impact on the cost.
Okay, and I suppose how have you seen, obviously the risks that we've talked about and the impacts of those, how have you seen them shared as between the employer and the contractor? Is it fairly balanced between the parties in the Middle East? Or does it tend to be skewed in favor of one party or another? How, in your experience, how have you seen these types of risks being apportioned between the parties?
See, in the major projects, yes, the risk has been shared between both the parties fairly, because the both parties are qualified enough, matured enough, they are contracts manager and so and so. But if you when you go to the subcontractors where the people are not qualified enough, in that case the risk is not managed fairly between the contractors and the subcontractors. I will say that.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I have a slightly contrary view, actually, Cheryl. So just add a bit of fuel to the fire. I think that what I've seen is quite depressing, actually. That I've been in this game for 25, 26 years, something like that. And when I first started out, they were starting to talk about risk allocation rather than risk transfer. And 25 years later, they're still talking about risk allocation versus risk transfer. And there's this notion that people, you sort of get the phrase of pass risk to the person or the organization best place to manage it, and everyone sort of recites that as the mantra. But when it actually comes to the actual reality, I don't think that's true. I think that there's this. I'm not sure whether it's laziness or foolhardiness, but often what we're seeing around the world is not sort of particularly isolated to one region. Is that clients are, for whatever reason, think the best thing to do is just throw the problem over the fence to the contractor and let them manage it. And so this risk transfer is much more commonplace than risk allocation. And I think what we're seeing in the kind of most mature projects, the most mature markets, is a sensible grown-up conversation, because we risk just as a fact of life with a project, and therefore. And we know that there's risks that repeat themselves across every project across the world, no matter what the sort of complexion of it. But actually, what we need to sit down is those areas of uncertainty to say what don't we know. And I'm a big advocate for collaborative contracting, and whether it's actually an official collaborative contracting or just co-developing a solution, I think there needs to be, it has to be client-led, sort of admission that we don't know all the answers, and we're employing contractors and subcontractors because we need their help, and we need their help because they've done this before. So why don't we actually leverage that experience? And so rather than just kind of throwing it to them to say, well, maybe you look after these risks for us, why don't we, through the tender process, through the selection process, use that as a basis to select the right partner who can help us mitigate these risks, but also work out how do we make the project better. So I actually think that risk is a sort of central theme of collaboration and actual tendering, and right the way through the life cycle. But it should be that risk allocation discussion should be central to that. And I think what I've seen is, the UK and Australia have certainly moved to this more, well, not always, but in many cases have moved to this kind of more allocation discussion rather than transfer. And happily, we're working with a client now in the Middle East where I'd say it's probably one of the worst areas for risk transfer. It's just give it to an EPCM or give it to a design and construct contract, lump sum. And actually what we're working with is to say, right, how do we mature that market to say, how do we have a really sensible conversation about risk allocation? So you literally sit in a room and you map out, here's your top 50 or top 20 risks or whatever it may be, and you have that discussion with each of your contracting parties to say, okay, well, we think we can do this. How about you? And you actually work through that to the point where you've got an executed contract, which is agreed, where that risk allocation comes. And to Akash's point, I think it's spot on, which is actually, if the employer transfers the risk to the contractor, well, the logical thing is for the contractor to then transfer it onto the subcontractor, which we know, is a kind of route to madness. So how do you actually bring your subcontractors into the discussion or set the tone from an employer point of view to make sure that this isn't just kind of this negative cascading process of risk?
Yeah, and have you seen in the UK the main contractors engaging with their subcontractor and supply chain downstream in that way? Yeah, so I might have a lot of wry smiles because I've got too many stories which I probably can't tell, but so some is the answer. And I think this is where, I talked about capacity, capability and culture being sort of three pillars of whether the projects succeed or fail. And I think what we recognise is there's good and bad clients out there, and there's good and bad contractors. And I think that what we're seeing really interestingly is because there's so much capacity constraint in the market now, you can no longer just say, well, I want this, you deliver that. There's kind of this war for talent. And I think if clients want to get the right capacity, they need to become a model client. And exactly the same is true for contractors as well. So you kind of, you get what you deserve to a certain extent. So if you can find, if the employer finds the right contractor, important word that, with the right capacity, capability and culture, then it should flow down that they're the right contractor to manage their subcontractors. Now, doesn't always happen, and I think what we see, there's a few major contractors out there who you'd say all the time are good contractors and they look after their supplier base, and then there's probably a few that we could probably talk about having a drink afterwards to go, actually their default setting is to ride roughshod over their subcontractors. So there isn't a universal truth to this. There's a depressingly large amount of variety, I'd say. Yeah. Okay. And we talked about obviously these types of risks. Are there more modern ways or better ways of sharing that type of risk? Obviously, some risks can be covered by insurance or security through bonds, but others are just, as you say, are part and parcel of carrying out a large construction project. So, a lot of it you've said needs to be employer-led. Does that mean changes to the procurement routes? Does it mean changes to the standard form contract? I mean, certainly here in the Middle East, I still see, FIDIC 4th 1987 or, FIDIC 1999 being very widely used, and people being just wedded to what we've done before and being very, very hesitant to almost embrace or to deviate from the trusted path of what's gone before. And again, projects tend to be, just in my experience, done on a very kind of one-off basis. So there isn't that openness for alliancing or really working, like you mentioned, collaboration, culture. I think here culturally, I've heard of projects, the contractor wins the job and immediately their first hires are their claims team. Mm-hmm. So it's very much set up as almost as adversarial. The culture at the moment here, I would say perhaps doesn't support that collaboration. But it'd be helpful, if Akash, if you share that view, or if your experiences has been different on the projects you've worked on.
Again, for the sharing of the risk, for me it is again how well the documents are in a place, instead of transferring risk to the insurance and all that. Those are the ways through which the risk can be insured. But the main important thing is how fairly the people have drafted those documents, how fairly the contractors and the employers have identified those risks. For example, the price escalations. Now in UAE, in most of the contracts, I have seen that there is no provision for the price escalations, and the contractor has to price for that. And if you see from the long terms, for the longer duration of the project,
I think we might have lost Akash. I think whilst we fix that, Dafydd, did you have any comments on particularly you mentioned the UK and Australia? Are there, is there things that we can learn from those, or trends that you've seen? You mentioned your yearly report that HKA produces to try and better share or better allocate risk.
Yes is the simple answer, and I think the point you were making around, I've only fairly recently started working in the Middle East, and it's quite a shock to the system in terms of the kind of the mindset that people are taking to projects and to delivery models, etc. And it is really, there's this kind of dyed-in-the-wool thinking, which is we've always done it like this, and yes, we know our projects are always late and they're always over budget, but we're okay with that. And it's almost the mindset and the approach is, well, that's just a fact of life, which is really counterintuitive, where you go, we know that the project's going to cost us 35% more, but we're still going to set the budget as, T minus 35. So why wouldn't we just kind of plan better? And actually, rather than, it's just self-defeating, but why do the lawyers and claims consultants benefit from this rather than the actual employer? And I think that what we've seen is that, it comes back to either, lazy clienting or unintelligent clienting, without being too rude, which says we just need to cover our backsides, and it's often the employer doesn't necessarily understand its risk. The lawyer's advising the employer goes, well, just make sure we've got this belt and braces covered to make sure you're not wearing any risk, and we just kind of all pass it on. And there's an educational piece required, which is which we've been on the journey in Australia and now in the Middle East. It's to say to lawyers that actually that the best way to protect your client's interest isn't just to tie them up in knots, but it's actually to help them deliver their project most successfully, where actually the client gets what they want ultimately, and the contractor gets. So targeting this win-win outcome rather than this kind of win-lose, which is the mindset I've seen. So again, this is not to say it's brilliant in Britain, it's brilliant in Australia. They've been on the journey. Australia particularly, it was really at the forefront of the alliancing models for a couple of decades ago, and whilst they were good, they were great, and then people worked out how to exploit them, and they were the silver bullet for a while, and then they became this kind of poison chalice, and you don't use the A word in Australia. And as the people have kind of gone on these kind of ebb and flow journeys around contract risk, people have come back to say, well, actually, it may not be alliancing, but so this collaborative basis whereby we work together, we co-develop the solution. And what I've seen depressingly is that there's so much copying and pasting between projects, and they're copying and pasting the wrong bits. So the point you made before, Cheryl, is that everyone thinks their project is unique and special and different, and that's the evidence says that's not true. The projects, I think it is that they're 80% more similar than they are different. So people tend to copy contracts and they copy commercial models, but what they don't copy is design and this kind of manufacturing approach to delivery. So I think we're focusing our efforts in the wrong place. So there's so many mega projects I've seen where the client says, oh, we're going to go do a PPP, or we're going to do a lump sum D&C, or whatever the model may be, but there's no process to go through and work out why. They've just said, well, it worked on this project. I was like, well, just because it worked on project X doesn't mean it's going to work on project Y. So laziness is too harsh. But I was depressing me after doing this for a while is that everyone knows that time, cost, quality risks exist, and seemingly don't do that much about it. So I do think there's a kind of palpable shift needed, and you need some sort of fairly vocal advocates, and you need some kind of exemplar projects to hold up and say, right, these were different, and why were they different? So if you look at the Project 13 model that's growing in popularity, which you've had a hand in, they've kind of looked at what makes projects successful. And so rather than looking at the causes of failure, which people tend to look at, is why don't we look at causes of success? And no surprises, there's causes of success are the things I've talked about. They are working collaboratively to kind of develop the solution. It's not about cost or lowest cost, it's about value. And I think that if you take this very mature grown-up approach and recognize that why do we have the pain at the back end, and why don't we actually focus the emphasis at the front end, then we might get sort of sort of quite a systemic shift in how we deliver projects.
Yeah. And then just looking ahead, we've obviously talked about a lot about the existing risks that we're aware of from historical projects and data that we have. Looking ahead, what do both panelists think about risks that are going to emerge and become more prevalent? I think for me, there's obviously a lot of chats in the Middle East and around the globe about sustainability and renewables. All of the countries in the Middle East have made very large and ambitious targets to achieve carbon net zero. So, for example, the UAE has a target to achieve it by 2050, Bahrain 2060, and so on and so forth. But how that is actually going to be achieved it isn't presently known. So, I mean, that to me as a lawyer seems to be quite a big risk that contractors, subcontractors, employers are going to need to look at. But I'd be interested to hear from both panelists as to what your thinking is in terms of further potential risks as the industry moves forward and as we see more technology and sustainability goals included. So I'll go to Dafydd first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? So the challenges you point to, particularly in the Middle East around sustainability, are interesting. Because I think Saudi's got somewhere approaching $1 trillion pipeline now, which is fabulous. And I think that there's some questionable targets about building ski resorts in the desert and all this kind of stuff, which is exciting. And I think it's done the right way. It can actually drive a symbolic shift for the world. Because actually, if you can deliver projects sustainably in the Middle East, you can do it anywhere. But I think that if you kind of take this kind of macro geopolitical lens and apply it to projects, it's really interesting. Probably the only time I can remember it in my career, which is that I think the infrastructure pipeline is bigger than it's ever been. And if the US has got $1 trillion pipeline, Middle East got $1 trillion, there's a couple of billions, a couple of 100 billion in Australia, same in the UK. Like, there's more work being conceived and delivered than I can remember. And that's good on one level, but there isn't enough capacity globally to deliver these projects. So you say, right, we've got a bigger pipeline than ever. We've got capacity constraints like we've never had before. So there's this competition for talent across the world. There's not enough contractors to deliver these projects. We've got COVID still. We've got Brexit. We've got war. We've got looming global recessions. We've got potential crises in the South China Sea. There's a lot of geopolitical risks that are kind of facing the construction sector as a whole. And it used to be you sit in your own local bubble and just manage it within your own backyard. But as these projects become more global or bigger in scale, then actually we need to think about this kind of global supply chain. So I think that there's factors which we hadn't really foreseen before. So pandemics was probably never on anyone's risk register. And let's hope nothing like that happens again. But you need to think about if you're relying on a global supply chain, how do you actually kind of ensure that your project is kind of robustly deliverable locally? And what we're seeing with hyperinflation around the world is the foreign exchange risk is huge. So you might do all the good planning I'm talking about, but if the US dollar spikes or crashes, then that's going to have a fundamental bearing on your project. So no longer can you just sit in your own little country or your own city thinking about your project. You actually need to take on this kind of geopolitical lenses to it. I think there's also technology is something you briefly mentioned. Depressingly, if you think construction projects go badly, technology projects tend to go 10 times worse. So as soon as you add data, digital and systems to a project, then God help you, because that requires a sort of different school of thought again. And I think that the weather impacts, what we saw in Australia was we went from floods to droughts to wildfires to floods to droughts, and so that just as a kind of from a project risk point of view, that's something that needs to be baked in. But when you start to look at portfolio risk as well, that becomes a challenge to say, do we need drought resilient infrastructure and creating desal plants, or do we need to have flood resilient infrastructure by new dams and dam wall raisings? And so there's this kind of changing tides, because it's moved so quickly as a result of climate change, that actually these decisions are no longer static. So it's how do you bake climate resilience into your infrastructure and into your projects is a kind of critical consideration.
That's great, Dafydd. You also mentioned obviously all of the post-pandemic. That it's great that all of the projects that have been announced are driving the recovery of various countries. So, as you said, the US has a huge pipeline. Saudi, in particular, has a hugely ambitious project. Do you think that those kind of things will lead to a risk in terms of almost what you might call brain drain, in that these projects obviously very prestigious, very exciting, and they obviously want the top talents, the best people with the experience. So having the types of people that have experience of all of the risks and managing those risks that we've talked about. So do you think there might be a sort of move of talent to these projects, leaving perhaps the more inexperienced people in other regions that are perhaps not able to offer those types of packages?
Yeah, 100%. I absolutely see that happening. And I think it's this war for talent, which everyone's talked about from an employee workplace point of view. I think applies to the construction sector as a whole. And I think that if you look at, I probably shouldn't name projects, but look at some of the giga projects in the Middle East at the moment, they're paying crazy money. Like, I shouldn't make it an advert, but they're paying 25% more than in any other project for staff. And so that kind of drives inflation in the cost of delivering a project any old how. So you do have this war for talent. And what we saw in Australia, where the first half of my career there, not much happened. A lot of projects were developed, but not many were delivered. And then the second half, when the government started to do this asset recycling, they found money to spend. And what you had is more work than the market could service. And then you had I always say small children and animals running these projects. So you had, there wasn't enough top talent to run it. And the very biggest projects had the very best talent. And then the category 2 or the category 3, you have people who were, let's say, learning as they went. And that, introduces a whole lot of risk. So I agree that, look at someone like NEOM. It's so massive and it's so, groundbreaking in terms of its thinking. It will attract the best talent. So I think there's almost like a moral imperative on projects of that scale to sort of give back to the broader construction community. And it might be a bit of a stretch, but I've always thought that something like NEOM, where it's 250, let's call it $500 billion, it's almost like the moon landings. It's so vast and it's so entrepreneurial in its scale and complexity that there's all these residual benefits that can come from a project of that nature. So there's building sustainable into the deserts is the obvious one to pick for. But how do they actually lead the way in developing a project so well and so good that it actually flows down the benefit to other projects? And I think that's my optimism creeping in to say that's possible. But I guess it's how do we make that happen? And what I've seen on, we've seen more commonplace, particularly out in the UK now, is kind of actively sharing your learning legacy. So London 2012 Olympics, it was all about leaving a legacy. And they created the Learning Legacy website, so they were able to share, the procurement models and the risk matrices and all the stuff that was done on that project that anyone in the world could access. And Crossrail, went from hero to zero and hero again. They did the same. So you go on the Crossrail Learning Legacy website, and there is, artifacts which tell you what they did and why they did it. And so there is it's accessible information now. But there's this, I guess, misalignment between we've got all the information to know why projects have gone wrong and gone right, but how do we actually get that into people's consciousnesses so they do that? So forums like this are good, but I think what tends to happen is when projects kick off, the minister or the stakeholder says, right, we're doing this project, it's going to go live in 5 years' time and it's going to cost you $2 billion, go and do it. And everyone goes into a mad panic and they get on and try to deliver it and they forget all these kind of case history from the past. And so I think that everything we've talked about here is nothing new, is it? It's been known for so long, and yet these processes still seem to keep on happening. And I think there's a need to probably think about construction projects entirely differently. So, and this is where things like giga projects like NEOM come in to say, rather than taking this classic artisanal approach to project delivery, how about we take a more modern approach, take a modern methods of construction approach, whereby we are taking a manufacturing approach whereby we are modularizing, we're off-site constructing, and actually not mitigating the risks of on-site construction, but eliminating them altogether. So if you look at what we've talked about, weather delays and ground conditions and all these kind of things, they exist because we're building in the real world of the elements. But you build elements in factories and off-site, and you drive them to site, suddenly that risk's gone. So I do think we need to stop trying to solve the same problem and actually think about it completely differently, and then we might have different outcomes.
That's great. And Akash, what's been your experience? Are you looking at, in the contracts that you manage, are you looking at issues around sustainability? Is there any move to introduce modular construction into any of your projects?
Again, from the contracts point of view, for the sustainability, that I cannot anticipate that the risk may arise because of the drafting of the contract. But for example, now we can see more crowd sitting in the UAE, and there might be a point that the designer may think about a rainwater harvesting, which we should have. Now, for example, there are so much floods which is happening because of the rain. For example, right now I'm in a Khaimah. If there is a rain for 7-8 hours, the entire roads are flooded. So when the designer will think about it, then for example, if they will think about it, that the amount which they are going to spend to build the project in such a way that they can do the rainwater harvesting, and the amount of returns in the entire life cycle of the project, are they getting that returns, the amount which they are investing on that. So this kind of risk still the UAE and the designer has to think about it. And this is the risk from the sustainability point of view that right now I can think about it.
Yeah, I think sustainability question and the risk around that is a really, really interesting topic in the Middle East. Obviously, we have a public, very ambitious goal of achieving net carbon zero. But as regards the regulations that will filter down from that in the projects, obviously that isn't known yet. So the extent to which that will affect, for example, the materials you can use on site, whether you will need to use different materials, that isn't known yet. And you may have to comply with various regulations and targets. So I think it's certainly a large topic that's on the radar, very public, and we're hosting COP28 very shortly. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that factors in. And again, Dafydd and you both mentioned modular construction. Again, it's quite new to this region. I haven't seen it used a lot, but I think there are projects that would certainly lend themselves to it. But as with any new technology, there's associated risk, a risk with that. So if you have a module or a particular component that isn't working or doesn't fit that's being used, then that's obviously going to go back to the delays and issues we talked about, timing and potential overrun at the start. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. I think it'd be helpful for our attendees to know what advice, firstly you, Akash, what advice would you have for the people that are listening around future-proofing and risk for any projects that they may be involved in?
Whenever the people are thinking about the project, the best thing is they should see the lesson learned from the previous projects, and how fairly again the contract is drafted, how fairly the risks are shared between the contractor. And specifically, I believe that the contractor should come in at the tendering stage, at the design stage, to understand, so that we can have the buildability of the contractor, the expense of the contractor, and the risk can be identified during the design stage, during the tendering stage, and the dispute can be avoided during the execution stage, which can give a successful project to the industry.
Great. And Dafydd, What advice would you give around risks and any practical tips for the audience?
So if I give very long-winded answers, as you probably noticed by now, but what I say on a previous point, you're talking about sustainability, and I think that what's really apparent is that if you take a serious approach to sustainability, you lower carbon, or reducing carbon reduces cost. There's kind of a clear link between those two things. And what we've seen is, there's been a trouble of getting people to come and work in our industry, particularly engineers, because they're going to go off and work for Google or Apple rather than, I won't say a firm, but like an engineering firm, because then the problems they're solving aren't that interesting. And what it becomes this very commoditized industry because it's just effectively copying and pasting from job to job. So if you've got these really smart, really capable people who want to solve problems, so let's give them the problem of de-risking projects to solve it. So how do we get them to think about sustainability or reducing carbon or thinking about modern methods of construction, whatever it may be, solve the problem that's actually at the root cause of everything we've been talking about today. And I think that's something that's really important. So I think there's a mindset shift required there. I think the things I'd like to think we should do differently and probably think about, one is recognize that your project isn't unique. It's not, by and large, all projects are similar. So champion similarities, to Akash's point, learn the lessons from all those similar projects around the world and apply your thinking to the new parts of it. I think don't rush to fail, go slow to go fast. Throw cliches at the wall, but I think that's the key thing, is like get all your, the opportunity to make a difference is at the front end of the project, not the back end. So apply your thinking there. And what's interesting is everybody around the world seems to create their own unique version of how do we do things better. It's been done to death now. I think it's actually about applying them rather than writing the books on it. So whether you look at Project 13, or you look at the OGC documentation out of the UK and the IPA, 6 pillars of procurement, the delivering outcomes report we produced for Infrastructure Australia, they all say the same thing, which is there are some universal truths to projects. So, I like doing this work to try and find out what the solution may be, but I'd rather see people implementing a solution. So we know what needs to be done. There's plenty of tools out there to support it. So, research this stuff, get in contact with me. I'm also happy to share any of these things, which is to say, apply what others have done well, and think about it properly. So rather than just saying, because it works in project X, it can work in project Y, what are those sort of conditions that made that success? So go through the process, get it done right up front, and I think then you've got a better chance of success.
And in terms of practical things, so if someone listening is working on a project today, is there any tools that they can use? So for example, like risk registers, things like that.
I think there is, and I think that there's a number of tools which I'd kind of default to. So there's this thing, might have changed its title, but there's the thing the UK government published probably about 10 years ago now, called the Project Initiation Route Map, and it's a really straightforward guide to setting the project up for success. And it thinks about risk, but it also thinks about procurement strategy, and it thinks about incentive models, and it's got a really comprehensive guide, and you can actually read that and go, okay, how do I apply this to my project? So I think if you Google OGC Project Initiation Route Map, you suddenly have inherited 10 years of learnings from UK failed projects. So I think that's something I'd really point to. And I think from a procurement point of view, I think actually most projects go wrong because of the procurement methodology chosen. 6 pillars of procurement, which was developed on the back of London 2012, has been life-changing for me as an individual and us as an organisation. And I think every single project we're involved in, we'll apply that 6 pillars of procurement, because it really forces the discipline of thinking about what are you actually trying to achieve? What can the market service? What is the risk? How do you want to incentivize it? So rather than just saying we're going to do a lump sum job over here or PPP over there, it actually thinks what is the most appropriate practice.
No, that's great, and thanks for naming those resources. I'm sure they'll be very helpful. I don't think there are any questions from our audience, but I think it's such a wide, interesting topic. I'm sure we could pretty much talk about it all day. But I think we are now out of time, so it just leaves me to thank panelists, Dafydd and Akash, for their very helpful insights and experience, and also to the RAKEZ for organising today's session, which I hope you've enjoyed. And as Dafydd says, please feel free to get in touch with any of the panelists directly if you have any questions or would like to discuss any issues raised in the discussion further. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.